Now, there's a flip side to trials that James talks about too: temptation and facing them. And that's in verses 12 to 18 of James chapter 1. Trials can turn into temptations. We want to blame somebody else for our failures. It's all their fault. We want to blame God. Why is God doing this to me? He can take this away any time. Now, the Jewish people that James was writing his circular to were quite possibly blaming God for the fact that they were poor and suffering because they were Christians. Jesus got into this mess. Now look what's happening. We're all poor. We're fighting amongst ourselves. Even you and I today can lash out when we're tempted. Why does this keep happening, God? Stop it happening. James is telling you and I today, God does not set out to make traps for you and I to fall into and be caught in. God doesn't want you and I to stumble. He's the one who gives us strength to endure temptation. God cannot lure you and I into sin. It is entirely against his character, James says. Rather, the temptation comes when you and I are dragged away by evil and enticed. We're tempted and we can succumb to temptation. It is not God's fault. The proper response to temptation in a trial, James says, is to avoid it. We can't blame God for our trials. Instead, James says, we acknowledge him as the one who does good through our trials. And when we respond with perseverance, James says, we'll be blessed. We'll receive the crown of life. But when trials make us turn away from God, well, that's our fault that we've turned to sin. And when we turn to sin instead of God, well, that dishonours God, doesn't it? It makes God out not to be trustworthy. A trial can turn into a temptation if we let it, if you look at verse 13. Even if we don't pursue temptation, in verse 14, we can still be lured and enticed. I kind of think of it as being like fishing. I'm a terrible fisherman, but I've been told by good fishermen that fish don't often take the bait the first time you put the bait in the water. That's why fishermen are so patient. They'll have another go, and then eventually that fish will take the bait, or at least one hopes. Now we're the fish. The evil one is the fisherman trying to bait us into temptation and falling into it and taking the hook. God is not the culprit in our trials. He's the deliverer of every good and perfect gift from above, James says, coming down constantly from the Father of lights, if you look at verse 17. So God's always being generous towards his people. So avoid temptation in your trial. Instead, consider it pure joy that your faith is being made resilient and Christ is walking with you. Instead, James says, move to true wisdom. And this is in verses 5 to 8 of chapter 1 of James. Now, the trials we go through really push us towards God, don't they? They make us want to pray for wisdom from God. And that's the goal I think God has for us, that we turn to him in prayer. And when we do this, James says, God will give generously to all without blame. Isn't that a wonderful promise, that he will do that for you in your trial? Now, you may have been the cause of your trial more than the other person. Maybe God will give you the wisdom then to not put yourself in that position again if you ask him for wisdom. Maybe God will give you the wisdom to get out of your predicament or get someone else to help you out of it, if you look at verse 5. Maybe God will give you the wisdom to know the way forward through the trial. Whatever he gives you, wisdom here in James is this. It's what we need to live God's way with right conduct for today. So wisdom in the Bible, it's very hands-on and practical. But let me say it again. Wisdom from God is what we need to live God's way with right conduct for today. Now, God's always wanting us to ask for wisdom and help. And to ask for wisdom without doubting we will receive it. That's very important. In other words, to have continuous faith. Otherwise, we're like the waves. Now, if the last time, I don't know when the last time is you've been to the beach. I walked along the beach on my day off this week, which was nice. And even on that day, looking at the waves out at Curl, you could see the waves were unpredictable. There were lots of surfers out on Thursday, and I was watching one particular surfer. He got a beautiful wave, came in, went out again, and then suddenly the ocean went flat. There was no swell at all. Very unpredictable. I'm sure if I'd stayed long enough, I would have seen a surfer get dumped by the next wave. When we go it alone without God, it may look like we're formidable. We're doing great without Him. We're strong and independent and Australian because that's the Aussie way. But actually, we're being inevitably pounded by the world. And eventually, if we don't stick with God, we're going to fall in a heap, just like a crashing wave, and get dumped. The faith that James says we need here is a continuing confidence in God's ability to answer our prayers and not doubt the character of God. He wants to give us His faith and love generously. But the consequences of doubting God's goodness, if you look in verse 7, are that God won't do a thing for us. Very strong words. If we don't believe He will answer our prayers in His wisdom. So friends, trust God, trust His Son, hold on to the wisdom that comes from God in your situation. The true wisdom, of course, is Jesus Himself. He is the wisdom of God. Do you remember what we said in our sermon a couple of weeks ago? The words of Jesus in John 16, verse 33, I think it was. There will be trouble in this world, but take heart, Jesus says, I have overcome the world. They're great words to hold on to when you're in the middle of your trial. And finally, don't forget the great words of James here in verse 18 of chapter 1. He chose to give us birth through the word of truth, that's Jesus, that we might be a kind of first fruits of all He created. Friends, God loves you. Don't turn away from Him now. Hold on to Him tightly, because He's overcome the world. More wisdom from James next Sunday.